Welcome, dear listener. Let your body begin to settle. Perhaps you've been searching for a moment of quiet, a pocket of stillness between the noise. You've found yourself in good company. Tonight, we will drift gently through the soft corridors of history, following shadows, silks, and the scent of ancient ink as we search for a woman lost in time, a queen draped in stories, layered in memory, who slipped into the silence of the ages, Cleopatra VII, and the tomb that has never been found. If you're new here, you're warmly invited to subscribe to our quiet corner of YouTube. And if you'd like, leave us a soft little comment below. Let us know where and when you're watching from. Perhaps you're listening late at night or drifting off with the morning light. So breathe in slowly. Let's begin. Imagine yourself now, standing at the edge of the Mediterranean Sea as twilight folds its lavender veil across the sky. Before you, Alexandria breathes gently, its white stone buildings glowing faintly in the last embers of the sun. You can hear the distant gulls, their calls softened by the breeze. The city is slowing. Merchants roll down the canvas shades on their stalls. Street fires are being lit in quiet ceremony. Somewhere behind a lattice window, the metallic ring of an oud is being tuned, its soft resonance carried through jasmine-sweetened air. This is Alexandria, the beating heart of Cleopatra's Egypt. Not a place of sand and camel, as one might imagine, but a cosmopolitan marvel designed by the Greeks, ruled by Macedonian pharaohs, and humming with many tongues. Greek, Egyptian, Latin, Aramaic, a crossroads of ancient worlds. Founded by Alexander the Great 3 centuries before her birth, the city stretched along the coast like a jeweled belt. Its roads were wide and ordered. The great harbor embraced warships and trade vessels alike. And towering above the sea, the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders, cast its gentle warning across the darkening tide. By Cleopatra's time, the lighthouse had stood for over 200 years. At nearly 400 feet high, it would have been visible from anywhere in the city. It blinked through cloud and wind, casting bronze mirrors of firelight into the fog. You might imagine her, the young queen, walking along the palace balconies, watching it flicker like a second sun. Behind her, in quiet grandeur, the royal complex. Palaces of soft marble and thick cedar doors. Pools of still water, catching the stars. The air was thick with incense, musk, and murmurs. Slaves moved silently, attending the flickering oil lamps, fanning the shadows that danced along painted walls. Cleopatra's Alexandria was a city of learning too. The famous library still stood, though perhaps diminished from its glory under the Ptolemies before her. Thousands of scrolls lined the shelves, parchment and papyrus, copied by hand under the watchful eye of royal scholars. The Mausion, the seat of study, hummed with slow, focused minds. Walk a little further into the city, past colonnades where philosophers muttered softly into their beards, past markets where Syrian dyes and Indian spices perfumed the dust, past fountains that trickled like lullabies through cracked mosaic basins. And somewhere within, guarded closely, was Cleopatra's world. Unlike her ancestors, Cleopatra spoke Egyptian fluently. She was the first of the Ptolemaic rulers to do so in over 2 centuries. Though Greek by blood, she embraced the imagery of Isis, the mother goddess. You would see her face painted on temple walls regal, composed with the horned crown and the sun disk. She ruled not just as queen, but as divine embodiment, a bridge between mortal and myth. And though Alexandria sparkled in the dusk, beyond its walls, Egypt wrestled with drought, rebellion, and hunger. The Nile, the eternal river, had faltered in its rhythms. And so the queen's world glittering, as it was carried, always the faint weight of instability. But for now, we linger in the quiet of her capital. Let your mind drift through the torchlit halls, through shaded courtyards where sandalwood smoke curls in the air, and into a room where Cleopatra herself might have sat. A room without urgency, without noise. Only the soft scratch of stylus on wax, the gentle ripple of linen curtains, and perhaps a thought forming like mist in the queen's mind. What will remain of her? What will be forgotten? The city winds down. Lanterns dim. The lighthouse keeps its silent watch. And so begins our journey. In the city where her story both bloomed and disappeared. Next, we'll step inside the rhythm of her daily life. A life both ordinary and exalted. A queen and a woman, living at the edge of an empire's fading light. Imagine now the sun's first stretch across the rooftops of Alexandria, the soft blush of morning filtering through gauzy linen, barely touching the tiled floor of a royal chamber. A faint breeze stirs the air, fluttering through open shutters. In the distance, the city begins to stir again, but here, within the palace walls, the world still lingers in half-sleep. This is the beginning of Cleopatra's day. You may picture her not as the elaborate figure from modern film with jeweled headdresses and dramatic gestures, but as something simpler, draped in soft linen dyed faintly with saffron, her feet bare against the mosaic floors, her dark hair long and oiled, yet unadorned in the earliest hours. She rises with quiet ceremony, in a chamber that smells faintly of lotus and myrrh. Slaves attend to her needs with gentle efficiency, offering bowls of water perfumed with crushed herbs. Her hands are washed, her face anointed. Silks are folded and preparation dyed in muted tones of seafoam and ochre, wrapped carefully around her narrow frame. The room is quiet. No one speaks unless invited. There are protocols, even in these intimate hours, that remain unbroken. The queen is not simply a ruler. She is a vessel of divine embodiment. She is Isis on earth. And each movement in the morning is a ritual echo of that belief. A cup of honeyed beer is offered. Bread, small and unleavened, sits waiting on a plate of black stone. These are not indulgences. These are continuations of tradition, symbols as much as sustenance. Her breakfast is modest. Dates, a handful of nuts, perhaps a fig or two. Sweet, dark wine diluted with water, poured from clay jars etched with faded glyphs. Nothing is rushed. Everything has weight. Once dressed and prepared, Cleopatra moves to her study chamber. This was not a woman content to simply preside. She was a student of philosophy, languages, economics, medicine, and mathematics. A rare scholar among monarchs. Scrolls are unrolled carefully upon her cedar desk texts in Greek, Egyptian, Latin, and even Hebrew. Her personal library was separate from the great Alexandrian archive and curated with precision. Her handwriting was said to be meticulous, her voice clear, her memory strong. She may have spoken as many as 9 languages, fluent in the tongues of diplomats and distant traders, able to converse with priests and scholars without an interpreter. Even Plutarch, a Roman writing long after her death, noted this unusual intellect, though always with the hesitant admiration the Romans gave to women of power. One might imagine her now, tracing her finger down a line of Herodotus, or cross-referencing a text on medicine. Perhaps she copies a verse in Coptic or examines a map of the Nile's tributaries. Then the administrative hour begins. She meets with scribes, advisors, tax officials. She examines yields from the Delta, reports of grain distribution, letters from temple overseers, and complaints from the provinces. There is nothing flashy in this, but there is control. Quiet, steady attention. She was managing a kingdom whose lifeblood came from a river that sometimes failed. Drought could mean death. Mismanagement, revolt. In her reign, Cleopatra spent as much time preserving the balance of Egypt's economy as she did navigating Rome's ambitions. You might expect a throne room, grand and echoing, but these meetings took place in more modest spaces. Chambers ringed with painted pillars, reed mats on stone floors, scrolls stored in stacked clay tubes. incense smoke curling lazily toward open windows. Her presence is not theatrical, but poised, and when she speaks, it is rarely with raised voice. Authority, for Cleopatra, lay in knowledge. She knew the value of appearing serene when the world trembled. By midday, the palace brightens. The sun, now high, throws shifting patterns of shadow across whitewashed walls. Curtains flutter. Laughter is heard from the servants' quarters, and the queen may retreat to her private garden. Imagine a small enclosed space, shielded by high walls. Date palms sway gently. A pond glistens with lotus blossoms. Lizards dart among pots of basil and frankincense. The air is heavy, slow. This is a place not of grandeur, but of pause. The sort of place where one sits cross-legged, breathing in, letting thoughts settle like dust. It's here, perhaps, that Cleopatra writes letters, some to Roman senators, others to her generals in the south. She was no stranger to military strategy. Coins from her reign show her in armor, holding a spear. And yet, in the garden, she is simply a woman, writing under the shade of vines. Afternoons drift on. She receives guests, ambassadors from Nubia, philosophers from Athens, traders with knowledge of silk routes and spice prices. It's a world of negotiation, always. And Cleopatra, the consummate host, remains composed. Conversations may take place over platters of pomegranate seeds, soft cheeses, spiced chickpeas. Music from distant rooms adds a low hum to the encounter. A harp, a flute. Not enough to distract, just enough to soothe. Her evenings return to ritual, bathing in scented waters, rubbing the day's dust from her arms. Perfume was a science in Egypt. Recipes recorded in scrolls, combining blue lotus, cinnamon, and rare resins in precise ratios. The oils were thick, fragrant, clinging to the skin like soft memory. Dinner is served late. Not lavish, though there are occasional feasts, but often reflective. A small gathering. Her children may join her. Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, would have been present at times. The room would glow with lamplight, flickering golden against alabaster walls. You may picture her, sitting in a high-backed chair, lifting a fig to her lips, her eyes distant, thinking always of what comes next. Because she was never entirely safe, powerful men in Rome watched her with suspicion. Her alliances were shifting, her future ever uncertain. But here, in this imagined moment, she sits still. The room smells of roast garlic and rose oil. The servants move in near silence. And beyond the arched windows, the lighthouse still burns its patient flame. Eventually, the palace sleeps. One by one, lights are extinguished. The moon takes watch. The sea sings its ancient lullaby against the stones of the harbor. And Cleopatra retires. Her bedroom is dark, cool. A single oil lamp glows beside a carved wooden bed. Linen sheets are turned down. A necklace is placed in a bronze bowl. The world, at last, is quiet. She lies back, eyes open, then slowly closing. The rhythm of her day, complete. Now, the night carries her thoughts, and hours into a deeper stillness. Now, let your mind wander beyond the painted walls of Alexandria. Let the garden's scent fade, the lamplight dim. Picture the world as Cleopatra saw it, not only through the cool corridors of her palace, but from above. From high in the air, like a falcon gliding on thermal winds. The Nile winds below like a green ribbon laid across golden earth. And far beyond, over the curve of the Mediterranean, lies Rome. Vast, hungry, unrelenting. This is the world of quiet danger, of politics played with murmurs rather than swords, of alliances inked in silken rooms and betrayed in whispered corners. Cleopatra ruled in the age of giants, and though she may seem to us distant, folded in myth and perfume, her reign was one of constant pressure. Each choice calculated, each silence deliberate. She moved like a queen on a chessboard, every step a response to distant, rumbling threats. Let us begin with the legacy she inherited. The Ptolemaic dynasty, founded in the wake of Alexander the Great's campaigns, had long ruled Egypt as foreign monarchs. By the time Cleopatra ascended the throne, the dynasty had weathered centuries of intrigue, fratricide, and erosion of power. The Egypt of the pyramids was ancient even then. The old gods still had temples, but the center of real power had shifted, and the eyes of the world turned increasingly toward the west. Rome, not yet an empire, but rising rapidly. Rome controlled the Mediterranean, like a coiled serpent, its influence extending through trade, diplomacy, conquest, and coin. By Cleopatra's birth around 69 BCE, Rome had already meddled in Egyptian affairs for decades. Loans had been extended, favors granted, and with each gift came a cost. She was born into a fractured Egypt. Her father, Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, the flute player, had been forced into exile, bribed senators, balanced precariously between Roman power blocks. His reign was deeply unpopular. Riots simmered, and yet, somehow, he survived. Cleopatra would learn early that survival was the true art of rule. At roughly 18 years old, she became co-regent with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. As was tradition, they were wed. Not in passion, but in ceremony, a political formality meant to preserve dynastic purity. But the reality was less harmonious. Power was not shared. Tensions bloomed. Within 3 years, Cleopatra had been driven from the palace, forced to flee Alexandria, stripped of her title. And it is here that the chessboard begins to reveal itself. Imagine now the banks of the Nile, the sound of wind rustling the reeds. Cleopatra, out of power but not defeated. She writes letters, sends emissaries, waits, and then learns of a Roman general's arrival, Julius Caesar, recently victorious in the civil wars of Rome, chasing his rival Pompey, who has fled to Egypt. Here, at last, is a moment. Cleopatra returns, not with an army, but in secret. Legend tells us she was smuggled into the palace, hidden within a rolled carpet or perhaps a linen sack, slipped past guards, unfurled before Caesar himself. We don't know if it's true, but the image remains, and with this meeting, history shifts. Cleopatra and Caesar form an alliance, one of power, and it seems of affection. He reinstates her to the throne. Ptolemy XIII dies soon after, in the chaos of conflict. A second brother is named co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, though he remains largely in her shadow. From this point forward, Cleopatra must balance the tightrope between Roman entanglement and Egyptian autonomy. Her relationship with Caesar cements her position at home, and yet it places her squarely in the gaze of Rome. Caesar departs, but before he does, she bears him a son, Caesarion. The child is named Ptolemy XV, though to many he is known simply as Little Caesar. His existence is political dynamite. If acknowledged by Caesar, as some believe he was then, Caesarion is a potential heir to the most powerful man in the world. And so, Cleopatra waits. Years pass. She governs, rebuilds. The kingdom begins to breathe again. But in 44 BCE, Caesar is assassinated. The Ides of March. Et tu, Brute. The world tilts again. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra faces a new game. Rome is plunged into civil war once more. Caesar's allies turn on one another. And from the chaos, two figures rise. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, and Mark Antony, his trusted general. Cleopatra chooses Antony. Their alliance is born of strategy, and perhaps of something more. In time, they become inseparable. She bears him 3 children. Their fates, like threads in a loom, tied tightly to the ambitions of their parents. But alliances invite enemies. and Octavian watches. From his seat in Rome, he whispers, sends letters, circulates rumors that Cleopatra has bewitched Antony, that Egypt seeks to dominate Rome, that the East is rising in decadent arrogance. The Senate listens. The mood shifts. War is declared not on Antony alone, but on Cleopatra herself. It is telling. Rome did not declare war on a Roman citizen, but on a foreign queen. And so, once more, Cleopatra prepares. The year is 31 BCE. Their fleets gather at Actium on the western coast of Greece. The sea is gray, uncertain. Cleopatra brings her ships, gold-plated, sleek, adorned with purple sails. She is not merely support, she is command. But the battle does not go well. Confusion spreads. Antony's forces falter. Cleopatra withdraws. And Antony follows. It is the end. They retreat to Alexandria. The city braces. The harbor fills with silence. The lighthouse continues to turn. And there, in the final quiet days of her reign, Cleopatra returns to ritual, to prophecy, to remembrance. Her death, when it comes, is recorded by Roman pens. Plutarch says she held an asp to her skin. Others say she drank poison from a hidden vial. We do not know. What we do know is this: she died as she lived, deliberate, composed, and still in control of her own narrative. But before the lamp was extinguished, she made one last request, that she be buried beside Mark Antony, together in death. And yet, we do not know where, not in the city of her birth, not in the halls of her ancestors, not in any temple we have uncovered. Her tomb vanished, as if, in the end, she chose not to be found. We will return to that mystery soon. But first, let us linger in the stillness that followed, the palace grown silent, the doors closed, the world moving on. Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, was captured by Octavian's men, executed quietly. Her other children taken to Rome, the Ptolemaic dynasty, ended. And yet, her story persists, carried not in tomb or statue, but in quiet, enduring curiosity. Now, the shadows in Alexandria have grown long. The courtyards are still. The laughter has faded. The scribes have stopped scratching their wax tablets. Outside the walls, Roman standards flutter like warnings in the breeze. The war has ended. Or rather, it has been decided. And within the palace cool, white-walled, perfumed with cedar and old incense, Cleopatra waits. It is the summer of 30 BCE. The queen is no longer young, still composed, still regal, but bearing the weight of loss with silent precision. Her city is occupied. Her lover, Mark Antony, lies wounded. The man who had once commanded the loyalty of legions, now reduced to a hunted fugitive. His soldiers have surrendered. His generals defected. There is nowhere else to turn. The accounts from this time come mostly from Roman pens, from Plutarch, from Cassius Dio. They wrote decades later, with biases of their own. But the story they tell is quiet and tragic, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the soft collapse of an era's breath. Imagine her now, walking slowly through the corridors she once paced in confidence. The mosaics beneath her feet depict gods and harvests, scenes of abundance, now distant. The servants are fewer. The great doors are half open, no longer guarded. And in the air, a kind of hush like a temple at night after the candles have burned low. In one room, Mark Antony lies dying. Misled by a rumor that Cleopatra has taken her own life, he has fallen on his sword, but he does not die immediately. And when he learns she is still alive, he begs to be taken to her. And so, in one of the most quietly heartbreaking scenes of ancient history, Antony is carried weak, broken, perhaps barely conscious into Cleopatra's mausoleum. She has locked herself inside it, perhaps already preparing for death. The heavy bronze doors will not open. Her servants lower him down with ropes through a window. There is no grandeur, no procession, only the sound of rope groaning against stone. And then he is there. They speak, briefly. She cradles him. They may have said little or much. We will never know. What we are told is that he died in her arms. And then there is only silence. Cleopatra retreats further. She meets with Octavian Julius Caesar's heir, now her captor. He is not yet Augustus, the first emperor, but he will be. He is cold, controlled, calculating. She tries to negotiate for her children. She offers treasures, offers even herself. But Octavian does not need gold, nor affection. He needs a triumph. He wants her alive, to march through Rome in chains. And this, Cleopatra cannot allow. She has seen the fate of defeated royalty. She knows the humiliation to come. She knows how history is written by victors, and that once bound in fetters, she would no longer be a queen, or even a woman, but a spectacle. And so she plans. 3 days after Antony's death, she prepares herself. Not in panic, not in grief, but in the manner of ritual. As she had lived, so she would die with precision, dignity, and purpose. She bathes, dresses in her finest robes, perhaps white linen, or deep blue edged with gold. The room is scented with crushed petals, cardamom, and smoke from a slow-burning resin. Her hair is arranged, her jewelry selected. Bracelets encircle her wrists like quiet armor. And then she withdraws into her mausoleum once more. With her are 2 servants, loyal women. They close the doors, and the city holds its breath. What happened inside is unknown. Roman accounts tell us she took her life by the bite of an asp, a venomous snake smuggled in among figs. Others suggest a poisoned needle, or a draught of herbs known only to Egyptian priests. The truth is lost. Octavian's men break down the doors. They find her lying still, serene, her robes unrumpled, a diadem upon her brow. The 2 servants, Iris and Charmian, are dying or dead beside her. Was this well done of your lady? A Roman soldier asks. Charmian, with her last breath, is said to have answered, yes, as befitting the descendant of so many kings. Cleopatra is 39 years old. Her son Caesarion is soon captured. Despite promises, he is executed, quietly, without ceremony. A last candle extinguished. The palace is seized, its rooms emptied, scrolls burned or taken, treasures plundered. The walls that once echoed with poetry and music now echo with the boots of Roman soldiers. And yet, in the midst of this silence, one detail remains unresolved. Where was she buried? She had requested to lie beside Antony. Octavian, later Augustus, may have granted the request. Plutarch suggests the 2 were interred together in a mausoleum. But where? No one knows. Was it within Alexandria? In the royal quarter now lost beneath sea and silt? Was it further west, in the sacred precincts of Isis? Was the tomb humble or grand beyond imagining? There are no answers, no inscriptions, no sarcophagus, no chamber carved into stone, just a lingering question, like a ripple on still water. Some believe the tomb was destroyed by earthquakes, war, or simple time. Others believe it remains, waiting beneath layers of soil and centuries. A sealed chamber, a forgotten chamber, a room wrapped in silence. In this, Cleopatra achieved something rare. A ruler of legend, a queen of vast renown. And yet, she vanished, not into obscurity, but into mystery. As if, at the final moment, she took control of her story one last time, closed the doors, and disappeared. Now, as the city of Alexandria settles once again into shadow, the lighthouse long gone, the harbor still and ancient, we too pause. Let your thoughts slow. We have seen her city, her life, her politics, and her death. Next, we turn to the question that haunts the edge of every scroll, every excavation, every whispered hope. Where is Cleopatra's tomb? A question asked by scholars, dreamers, and seekers. And one that, perhaps, history is not yet ready to answer. So now, we leave the quiet corridors of her palace behind. The scent of incense fades. The ripple of silken robes recedes. Cleopatra has passed into history. Her tomb is silent, unseen. But her face remains, or rather, many faces. It is strange, isn't it? How a person can be both known and unknown. How we carry an image in our minds, soft and certain, when in truth, it is woven from fragments, repeated lines, etched metal, dusty carvings. And so we begin again, not with her tomb, but with her portrait. Close your eyes, if you wish, and picture her. What do you see? Is she draped in gold, with almond-shaped eyes and painted lips? A coiled serpent crown on her brow? Eyes like daggers? Skin like marble? That image might be Cleopatra, or it might be a collage of art, memory, and centuries of retelling. Let's return quietly to the sources, to the objects that remain, still, cold, carved, unchanged for 2,000 years. The first place we see her most clearly is in coinage. Silver tetradrachms, small discs of metal, weathered by time, found in rivers, in ruins, in the hands of collectors and archaeologists. These coins were political tools messages in miniature, sent from ruler to subject, from kingdom to marketplace. On many, her profile is turned slightly left. Her hair is tightly bound in the royal melon style, a nod to Greek fashion. Her nose is long, almost aquiline, her chin firm. The eyes are not soft or delicate. They are wide, observant, powerful. To the modern viewer, used to the symmetry of film actresses and digital retouching, Cleopatra's portrait may appear stern, strong-featured. Some have called it masculine, some simply unconventional. But consider this. These coins were not mirrors. They were statements. Cleopatra chose to emphasize authority, wisdom, command. This was the face of a ruler who had survived exile, political coup, and the scrutiny of Roman generals. She was no girl queen to be adorned with fragile beauty. On other coins, especially those minted during her alliance with Mark Antony, we see an intentional mirroring. Her face and his, back to back, their brows aligned, their necks strong. She claims visual equality with the Roman general, not his wife or consort, but co-sovereign. These were not idle design choices. They were part of the long, subtle performance of power. Now, let's move gently from coins to sculpture. Only a few statues have been definitively linked to Cleopatra. One, in particular, resides in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. It shows a woman standing tall, her features carefully carved. The headdress is Egyptian double cobras, the uraeus. Her body clothed in the soft folds of a Greek chiton. She is both Isis and queen, both Hellenistic and divine. Another statue found in Rome, long thought to be her, depicts a seated woman, serene and reflective. The features here are less specific, more idealized. It may be Cleopatra, or another noblewoman. The line between image and identification is thin, uncertain. This uncertainty follows us, doesn't it? Through every room, every artifact. And yet, in this ambiguity, there is room to reflect. Even the inscriptions that name her are spare, precise. Cleopatra Thea Philopater, Cleopatra the goddess, lover of her father, a traditional title carried by several of her ancestors. But in her case, more resonant. She had, after all, restored her father's throne. She had ruled beside him, learned beside him, risen from the ashes of his troubled reign. The walls of temples show her in profile offering to the gods. She wears the sun disk and horns of Isis. She stands before Horus and Thoth, before Osiris and Anubis. These were not merely decorative, they were declarations. She was the daughter of the gods, the living link between Egypt's ancient past and its Greco-Roman present. And so, we begin to see a contradiction. In coins, she is Roman in style, realistic, firm, unflinching. In statues, she blends Greek and Egyptian forms. In temple art, she is purely divine. Which, then, is the true Cleopatra? Perhaps all of them. She was, above all, adaptable. A queen fluent in many tongues. A ruler who could write philosophy in the morning and command a fleet by nightfall. Who could stand in the sanctuary of Isis in Thebes, offering milk and incense to the statue of the goddess, and then days later host a Roman ambassador over roast goose and wine in Alexandria? Imagine her now, not as a single image, but as a shifting silhouette. She is seated, a scroll open in her lap. She stands, a fan of ostrich feathers brushing her shoulder. She walks alone down a corridor of polished stone, and in each vision, her face changes slightly, but the gaze remains. Clear, composed, knowing. It is perhaps no wonder that no single image of her survives untouched by debate. Even the coins so direct, so official, have sparked disagreement. Were her features truly as shown? Or stylized to resemble her father? Was her chin exaggerated to show strength? Her nose extended to match Greek ideals of nobility? No one knows. But in these contradictions, she becomes more human and more mythical. She is not the Cleopatra of Hollywood, nor simply the lover of Caesar or Antony. She is the strategist, the linguist, the priestess, the queen. And in the absence of her tomb, it is these images that remain, scattered, slightly blurred, but enduring. Let your mind wander now through the quiet galleries of a museum. White walls, glass cases, a hush like dusk. Coins glint faintly beneath a light. A broken statue gazes without eyes. And somewhere, perhaps if you listen softly enough, a whisper, not of seduction, not of tragedy, but of presence. Cleopatra remains, in metal, in stone, in thought. And now, as the scent of parchment fades, as coins are slipped back into their velvet cases, we begin to drift, not through Alexandria's streets, but through centuries of story. Because history, left alone, does not remain still. It ripples. It echoes. It is rewritten again and again, each time through a different lens. And no one has been more rewritten, more imagined, more transformed than Cleopatra. Close your eyes for a moment and think of her name. What comes to mind? Perhaps it is Elizabeth Taylor, in blue eyeshadow and towering golden headdress. Or Vivian Leigh, poised in cinematic shadow. Or perhaps a line of poetry. A serpent, a barge, a kiss, a queen of infinite variety. But long before she walked the film sets of the 20th century, she had already entered the theater of myth. It begins softly with Plutarch. He wrote nearly a century after Cleopatra's death, his lives a blend of biography and moral lesson. His portrait of her is one of charm, intelligence, and manipulation. He never met her. His sources were secondhand, but still, his influence lingers. From Plutarch, we hear of her linguistic brilliance, her cleverness, her voice that was like an instrument of many strings. He describes her ability to adapt, to shift her manner depending on the guest, to match mood and wit with subtlety. There is admiration in his tone, but also a quiet warning. To Plutarch, Cleopatra was a woman of immense power, and that, to Roman eyes, was both fascinating and dangerous. But it is in the pens of poets and playwrights that she begins to drift truly into legend. The Renaissance welcomed her as a subject of contradiction. In 1607, William Shakespeare penned Antony and Cleopatra, a play both languid and sharp. Cleopatra in his hands is volatile, poetic, seductive, proud. She speaks in lofty metaphors, weeps and laughs in the same breath, and dies with a flourish so grand that the stage itself must pause. Give me my robe, put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me. It is not the Cleopatra of the archives, but it is compelling. The play ripples with sensual language. The Nile flows like blood through the scenes. Antony is drawn to her like tide to moon. And in this telling, Cleopatra becomes less a queen of statecraft and more a queen of passion. She is not necessarily reduced, but she is reimagined. She becomes poetry, a symbol. And so, centuries later, when the silver screen arrives, she is already ready to be filmed. The earliest Cleopatra films appear in the silent era. In 1912, Helen Gardner portrays her in heavy kohl and regal pose. There are no words, only glances, gestures, costumes rich with velvet and fringe. She is mysterious, unreadable. And the background sets pyramids, sphinxes, and golden thrones form a kind of dream Egypt, filtered through early cinema's imagination. Later, in 1934, Claudette Colbert steps into the role. Her Cleopatra is witty, flirtatious, glittering. Her gowns shimmer like liquid silver. She reclines on ornate couches, laughs softly, raises one elegant eyebrow at Caesar. Then comes 1963, the year of the epic. Elizabeth Taylor. The production is infamous for its scale. Costing more than any film ever had, its sets were monumental, its costumes legendary. Cleopatra appears in dozens of outfits plumed, bejeweled, veiled in gold. She entrances Caesar, then Antony. The politics are grand, but the focus is intimacy, betrayal, and spectacle. Taylor's Cleopatra is not historical, but she is iconic. She moves slowly, deliberately. Her voice is low, melodic. There is a kind of spell woven around her, a slow unraveling of power through beauty. Yet the more dazzling she becomes, the further we drift from the real queen. Gone are the tax reforms, the famine management, the multilingual diplomacy. What remains is a figure of seduction. And yet, perhaps even this has value, because each portrayal, each reinvention, reflects something deeper, not about Cleopatra, but about us. In every age, Cleopatra has been remade in the image of its desires. To the Romans, she was a threat and exotic power who dared to challenge their authority. To Renaissance writers, she was a tragic muse full of longing, doomed by love. To early filmmakers, she was mystery incarnate. To Hollywood, she became spectacle fashioned in the mirror of glamour. And now, in our own time, we begin to ask new questions. What was lost in those retellings? What silences have gone unnoticed? What truths remain hidden behind the costumes? In modern scholarship, there is a slow, careful return to nuance. Writers explore her intellect, her policies, her religious reforms, her ability to command loyalty, not through allure, but through competence. There is interest in the woman as ruler, not just as romance, and yet the myth endures. Because myths, in the end, are not entirely false. They are lenses, soft veils drawn across the mirror of history. And Cleopatra, ever shifting, ever adapting, seems uniquely suited to wear them. You may imagine her now, seated in an empty theater. The seats before her are vacant. The stage is quiet. She watches as her image flickers across the screen. Different faces, different voices, the same name. Perhaps she smiles. Perhaps she says nothing at all. Next, we'll search for the truth buried under these layers. The real queen, the woman who lived and ruled, and how time itself began to forget where her story ended. Now, imagine yourself walking through a corridor lined with veils. Each one, thin and floating, sways gently as you pass. Each veil is a version of Cleopatra, a face imagined, a voice remembered, a line of poetry, a flickering scene from a film. Some are soft and golden, others dark and dramatic. All are beautiful. All are partial. As you move forward, one by one, you brush through them. And at the end of the corridor is the woman herself. Or rather, what remains of her. History, real history, is often like this. Not a single clear window, but many layers of mist and reflection. And the work of the historian, quiet, persistent, is to look through those veils, to ask, what do we truly know? And what have we simply inherited as belief? Cleopatra is among the most veiled of all ancient figures. She has been, over time, sainted and slandered, called a whore, a genius, a goddess, a manipulator, a patriot, and always alluring. But how much of this is her? And how much is projection? Let us step gently into the fog of fact and fiction. We begin with the records. Cleopatra left no autobiography. No personal letters have survived. No journals or manifestos. What we know of her, what we truly know, comes from others. From Roman historians. From inscriptions. From coins. From fragments. And Roman historians were not always kind. Dio Cassius, Plutarch, Suetonius. They painted her through the lens of empire. Rome had conquered Egypt. And Cleopatra, intelligent, foreign, female, became a symbol of everything Roman order was not. In their words, she is dangerous, sensual, cunning, a siren whose voice drowned mighty men. But pause a moment. These accounts were not neutral. They were written to justify conquest, to explain Antony's downfall, to make Octavian's victory, Augustus's rise, seem righteous and inevitable. To them, Cleopatra had to be seductive, because otherwise she would be effective, and that was more dangerous still. Yet despite the bias, their accounts hold traces of truth. Even through slander, they cannot deny her education, her languages, her political maneuvering, her resilience. And when we compare their words to what survives in material culture, in coins, inscriptions, temple reliefs, a quieter, steadier image begins to form. One of discipline, of statecraft, of endurance. Cleopatra ruled for 21 years. Through droughts, rebellions, shifting alliances, and Roman encroachment, she maintained Egypt's independence longer than expected. She restored temples, rebuilt trade, manipulated Roman civil wars with remarkable timing. This was not seduction. This was governance. Consider, too, her multilingualism. Plutarch reports she spoke 9 languages. This was not decoration. Egypt was a patchwork of cultures: Greek, Egyptian, Nubian, Semitic, and Cleopatra's ability to communicate across these lines gave her unusual reach. She spoke directly to priests, to scribes, to emissaries from distant lands. She did not rely solely on interpreters. She listened and she understood. This alone marks her as rare. And yet, in art, in film, in many books, this detail is often forgotten. Why? Because intellect is quiet, and spectacle is loud. This tension, the one between who she was and what she became, is where myth begins. It is no one person's fault. It is the nature of fame. It erodes and reshapes. Over time, even historical figures become more useful as symbols than as people. Cleopatra became the symbol of the East, of female power, of ruinous beauty. She became a mirror onto which societies projected their desires and their fears. But what if we look again, gently, carefully? Imagine her not as a legend, but as a ruler at a desk. Scrolls unrolled before her, the scent of ink and reed paper, a flickering oil lamp. She examines grain tallies, tax receipts, military reports. She is 35. She is tired, but focused. Outside, Alexandria glows beneath a dusty sunset. The harbor stirs. The lighthouse turns its steady gaze. This is not myth. This is administration. She governs not through seduction, but through calculation. She writes letters in Greek and Egyptian, offers sacrifices at temples, names her children with deliberate symbolism linking them to both Ptolemaic and Roman lines. She commissions statues of herself not only as queen, but as Isis blending Greek royal imagery with native Egyptian devotion. All this to hold her country intact? Was she flawless? No. She made choices, some bold, some risky. She aligned herself with two Roman men whose defeats cost her everything. She believed in Egypt's independence longer than the world allowed. But flaw does not erase competence, and myth does not replace truth. What we begin to see, when the fog is parted even slightly, is a figure far more compelling than legend. A woman who refused to disappear, who used every tool available to her: language, image, lineage, diplomacy. A ruler who did not simply inherit power, but worked tirelessly to maintain it. And yet, as time passed, the layers returned. The myths grew. The veils were drawn once more. And her tomb, the place where her bones might have spoken quietly of her truth, was lost. Perhaps that is the final irony, that we remember her image, but cannot find her body. We tell her stories, but have lost her voice. She remains, in some way, unsolved. But maybe that is how she would have wanted it. A queen who spent her life controlling her narrative would not so easily surrender it in death. Let us return now to the space between memory and earth. Cleopatra has died. The last breath has been drawn. The incense has burned low. Her eyelids closed not in fear, but in intent. A queen no longer alive, but not yet forgotten. And yet, as centuries passed, something unusual happened. The details of her death survived. Her deeds were recorded, some twisted, some true. But the place of her burial, disappeared. It is rare, you know, for someone of such renown, of such royal stature, to vanish so completely from the physical map. For there to be no mausoleum to visit, no sarcophagus to display, only questions, only air. So, how did this happen? How do we misplace a queen? To answer that, we must slow down and step through time. Let the sand fall softly, grain by grain. We begin in 30 BCE. Cleopatra is dead. Rome, under Octavian soon, Augustus claims Egypt as a province. The age of pharaohs ends with her final breath. If she was buried beside Antony, as ancient sources suggest, then a tomb was built, likely quickly, perhaps modestly, perhaps grand. Plutarch tells us it was within Alexandria. He describes it briefly, almost offhandedly, noting that it held treasures, scrolls, and the remains of both Cleopatra and Mark Antony. He does not describe its size, or its precise location. The Roman general Agrippa, Octavian's right hand, is said to have sealed it. And then, silence. Rome had little interest in preserving Egyptian royal memory. Why would they? To honor Cleopatra would be to honor a rival. To leave her tomb prominent would invite pilgrimage. And the Rome of Augustus needed her forgotten, not praised. And so, the city began to change. Alexandria, once the crown of Hellenistic culture, was remolded in the Roman image. Statues were repurposed. Temples were rededicated. Inscriptions were chiseled away and rewritten. History was not erased with fire, but with subtlety. With time, over the next 3 centuries, Christianity began to rise. Slowly at first, then with vigor. Alexandria became a center of theological debate, of bishops and monks, of conversions and councils. Pagan symbols, including those of the Ptolemies and their gods, were increasingly viewed with suspicion. Many temples were closed. Some were destroyed, others abandoned to the wind. The name Cleopatra persisted, faded, but familiar. But the place of her burial, if marked, was no longer visited, no longer spoken of. By the 4th and 5th centuries, even the memory of her tomb's location had likely dimmed to legend. And then, the city itself began to crumble. Alexandria sits on a fault line, not only political, but geological. Earthquakes shook the coast. In the year 365 CE, a massive quake struck the region, followed by a tsunami that drowned the harbor and leveled great swaths of the city. Temples collapsed. Monuments fell into the sea. The royal quarter where Cleopatra might have lived and died was swallowed. What remained above ground was buried in silt. Stones shifted. Walls cracked. And over centuries, new structures were built atop the ruins, layer upon layer. Like papyrus sheets glued together, the city became a palimpsest, its older stories hidden beneath the newer ones. Imagine it. A column fallen into the sea, now home to coral. A carved frieze, once touched by the queen's own hand, now silent under centuries of sand. A doorway, long sealed, behind which, perhaps, the tomb still rests. But history is not only lost by accident, it is also lost by neglect, by the shifting gaze of empire, by what is chosen to be remembered, and what is quietly set aside. In the Middle Ages, Egypt became part of the Islamic world. Alexandria remained a port, but the memory of the Ptolemies grew distant. There were no pilgrimages to Cleopatra's grave, no grand markers, no inscriptions left to weather the sea air. She was remembered not through stone, but through story. In the West, her myth re-emerged during the Renaissance. But the location of her tomb was no longer known. By then, the city had been rebuilt many times. Streets had shifted, foundations buried. Scholars wrote of her, artists painted her, but no one knew where she lay. And now, in the 21st century, we still do not. Despite sonar scans of the seafloor, despite excavations at likely sites, despite careful study of ancient texts, her tomb remains hidden. Some believe it lies beneath the modern city sealed, beneath roads, apartment buildings, or ancient ruins now reused. Others suspect it lies further west, in the temple complex of Taposiris Magna. A few even believe it was long ago destroyed, stones scattered, bones turned to dust. But no one can say with certainty. And so we are left with absence. A mystery not just of stone, but of silence. A tomb that has, in its very vanishing, become part of the legend. But perhaps that is fitting, because Cleopatra, more than most, understood the power of image, of presence and absence, of legacy. She built herself as a goddess, as a scholar, as a ruler whose influence crossed continents. Perhaps in the end, she ensured that her final act, the location of her resting place, would remain hidden, a final choice, a final mystery. And in this mystery, her story continues, not as a line on a map, but as a question whispered through time. Where is she? Not in a museum, not beneath glass, but in memory, and in the quiet places where we still wonder. And now, we turn our gaze from myth to earth, from the shimmer of story to the quiet of stone. Because if we are ever to find Cleopatra, we must first understand the world that buried her. Close your eyes, if you wish, and imagine a vast desert. Not one of empty sand dunes, but a landscape dense with memory. Obelisks rise like stone needles. Temples stretch toward the pale sky. And beneath the surface lie the dead. Egypt has always been a land of tombs. Its people, across thousands of years, built cities for the living and cities for the dead. And these necropolises, these places of the departed, were not grim. They were ordered, designed, full of meaning. To understand Cleopatra's tomb, we must look backwards, past her dynasty, past the Greeks, even past the New Kingdom pharaohs. Let us begin, gently, with Giza. Here, in the 3rd millennium BCE, the Great Pyramids rose. Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure. These were not tombs in the modern sense. They were cosmic machines, constructed with precision, aligned to stars, wrapped in myth and mathematics. The pyramid was a portal, a way to ascend, a place not simply to bury, but to transform. The dead were mummified, their organs preserved in alabaster jars. They were placed in sarcophagi of stone, within chambers lined with offerings and spells. Everything had meaning, even the direction a tomb faced, even the symbols carved into its lintels. Time passed. Dynasties rose and fell. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE, the tomb had shifted inward. The Valley of the Kings replaced the open pyramid. Tombs were carved into rock faces, hidden, protected from thieves, Rameses, Seti, Tutankhamun, buried in corridors painted with sacred texts. Passages wound deep into stone, each chamber filled with gold, with perfumes, with the soft breath of silence. But then, the world changed again. The Greeks came. In the 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great swept through Egypt, and with him came a new way of death. The Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek in language, Egyptian in rule-blended traditions. They kept mummification. They honored Osiris. But they also brought in new architecture, new aesthetics, new rituals. Imagine now a different kind of tomb. A chamber cut into soft limestone, walls painted in vivid color, a sarcophagus set into the earth, not towering, but humble. Around it, inscriptions in Greek and Demotic side by side. The dead might be wrapped in linen, but their portraits were painted. Look closely, and you see them faces gazing from wooden panels. Eyes large, skin shaded with ochre and ivory. These are the Fayum mummy portraits, so personal, so human. And yet they are dead. It is this world, the Greco-Roman funerary world that Cleopatra lived in. Not pyramids, not towering statues, but blended tombs. Tombs that echoed the old forms and softened them. And here, another change. By Cleopatra's time, burial was not always about grandeur. Many tombs were modest, carved into the earth beneath temples or gardens. The Ptolemaic rulers had royal precincts, but their burial practices were often private, not public. Her ancestors, the earlier Ptolemies, may have been interred in the royal quarter of Alexandria. Some scholars suggest they were laid to rest in mausoleums close to the palace, perhaps even in the now sunken areas near the eastern harbor. If so, then Cleopatra's tomb may have been built to match. Not a pyramid, not a valley, but a room, a chamber, possibly attached to a temple, or within a palace wall. It would have contained her body. And Antony's, perhaps side by side, perhaps in separate niches, offerings, inscriptions, gold diadems, a statue of Isis, a serpent etched into the stone. But what kind of space would this be? Likely sealed, likely small, perhaps just a single entryway, hidden beneath paving stones. Some Greco-Roman tombs in Egypt were even beneath bathhouses, beneath courtyards, quiet places unassuming. Their preservation depended not on size, but on secrecy. Which brings us to a truth. The tomb we seek may not be large. It may not shout. It may whisper, and that makes it harder to find. You may imagine now a team of archaeologists brushing away sand from a faint outline, a broken stone door, a faint glyph, an airless chamber long unopened. Or you may imagine a street in modern Alexandria. Cars pass above, shops open and close, and beneath the sidewalk, silence. The city grew, the water rose, the maps were lost, and Cleopatra's tomb once, perhaps a modest, sacred space, fell into shadow. But the burial traditions give us a frame. We know she would have chosen care. We know she revered Isis. We know she planned. And so, somewhere beneath temple or earth, beneath ruin or reef, her final resting place waits. Still sealed, still unknown. Now, let us turn softly to the written word. Long after Cleopatra had vanished from her city, long after the salt air of Alexandria had eaten away stone, and the lamps in her palace had burned their last oil, men in distant places began to write her story. Not those who had seen her, but those who had heard. Heard tales, heard murmurs, heard the shape of her life as passed down through time. And it is from these echoes that we gather our faintest clues. The most detailed comes from Plutarch, a Greek biographer writing in the 1st century CE, about 130 years after Cleopatra's death. In his Life of Antony, he devotes several pages to the final days of both Antony and Cleopatra. It is from Plutarch that we hear the famous tale of Antony's suicide, of him being lifted wounded into Cleopatra's mausoleum, of the doors barred, of the servants who refused to open them for fear of Roman capture, of the ropes and the sorrow. He writes that Cleopatra had constructed a tomb for herself near the temple of Isis, and that she had already filled it with treasures, gold, silver, and royal ornaments. The implication is subtle, but important. She was preparing not just for death, but for remembrance. The temple of Isis, her chosen deity, the divine mother, healer, protector of the dead. This temple, likely located somewhere near the royal quarter of Alexandria, would have been a logical, sacred site for such a tomb. Plutarch does not give us coordinates, but he gives us a context. A tomb built before her death, near sacred ground, prepared with ceremony. He also tells us that after her suicide, Octavian, later Augustus, allowed her to be buried with Antony, not out of affection, but perhaps as a calculated act of closure. And so, according to Plutarch, the two rulers, enemies of Rome, were laid to rest in a shared tomb. But what does buried together truly mean? Were their remains placed side by side in a single chamber, or in separate sarcophagi within the same mausoleum? Was the tomb marked? Was it sealed with inscriptions? Was it hidden, destroyed, reused? Plutarch does not say. He moves on, as ancient writers often do, preferring drama to detail. He leaves the tomb behind, and so must we. Next comes Cassius Dio, a Roman historian writing in the 3rd century CE, 200 years further still from Cleopatra's lifetime. In his Roman history, Book 51, he briefly describes her death and its aftermath. He confirms the tomb, confirms her burial with Antony, but adds little more. Dio, like Plutarch, seems less interested in geography than in theater. He writes of the asp, of her final meals, of the rumors that Octavian had her killed and only said she took her life. He mentions the tomb, but does not dwell there. Another voice comes from Strabo, a geographer who actually visited Alexandria during Cleopatra's lifetime, though he was young at the time and wrote decades later. He describes the city with care, mentions the palace complex, the royal quarter, the harbor. He lists temples, streets, monuments, but he does not mention a tomb for Cleopatra. This absence is haunting. If it had been grand, visible, or marked, Strabo might have noted it. His silence suggests something smaller, something hidden, or perhaps something not yet built when he last saw the queen. These three, Plutarch, Dio, Strabo, form the foundation, the whisper-thin scaffolding on which centuries of speculation have been hung. And then there are the later voices, writers of the medieval and early modern eras, pilgrims, priests, travelers. They mention Cleopatra in passing, as legend, as ruin, as echo. They speak of temples now crumbled, of statues fallen, but no one claims to have seen her tomb. No pilgrim visited it. No chronicler recorded its rediscovery. It had vanished, it seems, even by the time Rome was young. You may imagine now a scroll aged, frayed, faded at the corners. A line written in black ink. She was buried beside Antony. And nothing more. No map. No diagram. Just the sentence, like a breath against stone. There are other, smaller sources. Inscribed objects, coins. Later historians referencing earlier ones. But none provide coordinates. None point to a doorway. None give us the shape, the size, the materials. And yet, even these thin threads offer us something. A general location, near a temple of Isis. A burial allowed, not denied. A tomb filled with riches perhaps looted, or perhaps sealed still. What we must ask ourselves is this. Did Octavian truly honor her request? Or was the tomb symbolic and empty gesture? Was the burial grand and public? Or quiet and concealed? And if she was interred in a tomb near the temple of Isis, then where was that temple? That is a question archaeology still seeks to answer. Now, we find ourselves back in Alexandria, not the bustling modern city of traffic and markets, but the Alexandria of memory, of foundations long buried, of stone steps leading into silt, of quiet underwater courtyards. The Alexandria that held Cleopatra, and then let her go. Let your thoughts drift across the shore. A breeze lifts from the sea, the scent of salt and dust. Waves lap gently against breakwaters that have stood for millennia, and beneath the surface lie the ghosts of a royal city. Because much of ancient Alexandria is no longer on land. It is beneath the sea. Let us go back slowly to when it was whole. Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. He envisioned a city of geometry and order, a gridded layout of broad avenues and narrow alleys. 2 harbors, 1 lighthouse, and in its center, a royal quarter. This quarter, called the Bruchion, was the jewel of the city. Here stood the palaces of the Ptolemies, the museum, the famed library, gardens, baths, pavilions, and most likely, the mausoleums of the royal family. It was here, perhaps, that Cleopatra walked, here that she met Caesar, here that she reigned. But today, the Bruchion is gone. Partially, it lies beneath the modern city. Buildings, roads, layers of stone built on older stone. And partially, it lies underwater. The coast of Alexandria has changed over time. Not suddenly, but steadily, with the quiet persistence of tide and tremor. Between the 4th and 8th century CE, a series of earthquakes struck the region. Ancient walls cracked, columns toppled, and in the year 365 CE, a particularly massive quake accompanied by a tsunami devastated the city. Parts of the royal quarter were swallowed by the sea. Entire streets slid into the harbor. Granite statues some weighing tons were carried by water and dropped into silt. Porticos collapsed like cards. Temples disappeared beneath rising tides. Imagine it, a single afternoon, the roar of earth and wave. A city trembling, a palace falling, and then silence. The sea covering what had once been the heart of an empire. Over centuries, the shoreline shifted. Harbors were dredged, docks rebuilt. The city moved inland, and much of what once stood proud was forgotten. Even in ancient times, some sections of the royal quarter were already inaccessible. By the Middle Ages, few knew what lay beneath the water. But in the 1990s, a quiet rediscovery began. Marine archaeologists, diving into Alexandria's eastern harbor, found what had long been suspected. Columns, sphinx, statuary, blocks of inscribed stone, all resting just beneath the waves. These were not random ruins. They formed patterns, fragments of once coherent buildings. One statue, nearly 6 meters tall, was identified as possibly representing Cleopatra herself draped in the sacred robe of Isis. Another depicted a man, thought to be either Caesar or Mark Antony. Their bases, their plinths, still rested on the submerged foundation stones of ancient temples. Not far away, divers found what appears to be part of the island of Antrahonos, once a royal island, now entirely submerged. It is here that some believe Cleopatra's palace may have stood, a complex of halls, docks, and gardens, surrounded by water on all sides. And if the palace stood here, could the tomb have been nearby? Perhaps. But here, again, the mystery deepens. The tomb, if built close to the palace, may now lie in pieces at the harbor's floor, collapsed, flooded, its chambers filled with silt and coral, its inscriptions eroded by the slow brushing of waves. Or it may lie beneath today's city, beneath shops, apartment buildings, streets crowded with the movement of daily life. Few excavations have been possible in central Alexandria. Modern development makes it nearly impossible to dig. Each spade of soil is tangled with modern foundations, pipes, power lines. Archaeology must wait. And so, a possibility remains. That the tomb is there, not far, just below, unseen. You may imagine now a quiet side street, children playing, a woman watering her plants, a stone beneath her garden, cool and ancient. Beneath that stone, a wall. Beneath that wall, a chamber, sealed, still, waiting. It is not impossible, and that possibility is part of why this mystery endures. Because Cleopatra's final resting place is not only a matter of history, it is a question that lies just beyond reach, lost not by chance alone, but by earthquake, by empire, by the slow forgetting of cities that rebuild themselves again and again. When the light is right and the harbor still, you can almost see the outlines below, of columns, of arches, of something sacred. Now we begin to gather the threads of possibility. We have walked through the tomb traditions of ancient Egypt. We have read the fading accounts of Plutarch and Dio. We have floated above the submerged stones of Alexandria's lost palace. And yet, the tomb has not been found, but the search has not ended. In fact, in our own time, it has quietly intensified. There are theories, real, reasoned, researched possibilities. And though they are only fragments of hope, they shimmer faintly, like light at the bottom of a deep pool. Let us begin with the most enduring theory, the one that has drawn headlines and camera crews and scholars with patient hands. Taposiris Magna, 45 kilometers west of Alexandria. A temple complex set inland, away from the modern city, where desert meets green. Its name means Great Tomb of Osiris, and its roots stretch deep into Egyptian religion, into the sacred myths of rebirth and kingship. The temple was founded in the 3rd century BCE, during the early Ptolemaic period. Dedicated to Osiris, it stood not as a tomb in itself, but as a ritual space, a place of ceremonies, of offerings, of transition. Could Cleopatra be buried here? Some think yes. Dr. Kathleen Martinez, a Dominican archaeologist, has led excavations at Taposiris Magna since 2005. Her theory is simple and quietly compelling, that Cleopatra, devoted to Isis, familiar with Egyptian religious symbolism, might have chosen to be buried in a temple dedicated to Osiris, husband of Isis. A symbolic union, a sacred echo, a final gesture in keeping with both belief and power. The temple ruins are vast. Within them, Dr. Martinez and her team have found clues. Coins bearing Cleopatra's face, carvings in Ptolemaic style, an intact burial shaft descending deep into the rock, tombs, mummies, and the remains of a once grand structure. There are corridors still sealed, passages not yet fully explored. And though no sarcophagus of the queen has been found, the possibility remains. It is quiet work, delicate, slow, and while some scholars remain skeptical arguing that a queen of her stature would more likely be buried in Alexandria itself. Others are watching with cautious curiosity, because the site is right, the symbols right, the secrecy fitting. Yet we must also consider the other possibility, that Cleopatra was buried, not west of Alexandria, but in the city's vanished royal quarter. This theory holds weight. Plutarch's account places her tomb near the Temple of Isis, and there was such a temple within the royal quarter. Its precise location is uncertain, but scholars believe it stood near what is now the submerged island of Antirhodos, a same island believed to have hosted her palace. Here, then, we imagine something different. Not desert stone and temple columns, but a mausoleum built among the palace gardens, perhaps within a private sanctuary, perhaps beneath a shrine. When marine archaeologists began diving in the 1990s and 2000s, they uncovered parts of what may be this very island: pillars, sphinx, foundations. The remains of docks and steps, now shrouded in seaweed and shadow. Could the tomb be here? If so, it is under the sea, flooded, cracked by earthquake, covered by centuries of sediment. Recovering it would take time and fortune, and still, perhaps, the permission of the past. There is a third theory, quieter, more haunting, that her tomb is lost not to nature, but to us, that it lies beneath the modern city, under concrete, unmarked, inaccessible. If the tomb was modest tucked beneath a courtyard, or beneath a now buried shrine, it may remain intact, but it may never be reached. Because to dig in modern Alexandria is to disturb life. To unearth history is to close roads, move homes, shift infrastructure, and so the past must wait. There are still other suggestions. The eastern necropolis, the nearby temple at Abusir, even the base of the Pharos lighthouse, once sacred ground in itself. But none have yielded certainty, and so the tomb remains, suspended in a kind of limbo, between Taposiris Magna's desert breeze, between the sea floor's broken colonnades, between the hidden stone beneath a modern cafe. You may imagine now, a sealed room. It has not been touched in 2,000 years. Its air is still, its floor swept with time. 2 sarcophagi, simple, dignified, a wall painting, the Eye of Horus, an inscription faint, eroded, and silence. Perhaps it is real. Perhaps it is only what we imagine. But even unconfirmed, it shapes how we think. Because the mystery of Cleopatra's tomb is not just about discovery. It is about reverence and patience. Imagine now a brush moving gently across stone, a breeze stirring grains of sand as dawn breaks across a flat horizon. There are no headlines here, no shouting discoveries, just the slow rhythm of archaeology, a practice less like treasure hunting and more like listening to the ground. To find Cleopatra's tomb, or any tomb long hidden, one must become fluent in silence. The work begins long before a trowel touches soil. It begins with satellite images, with contour maps, with deep study of soil composition, historical texts, tide records. It begins in libraries, in laboratories, in slow, meticulous preparation. And then, one day, the team sets out. They arrive at a site with no signs, no ruins above ground, just a field, just rock, just the endless hush of wind and time. The archaeologist kneels and begins. The tools are humble. Brushes made of boar's hair, wooden picks, trowels with curved handles, buckets, notebooks, sieves, and hands steady, careful hands. There is no rushing here. A single square meter might take a day, or a week. Each layer peeled back must be documented, sifted, recorded, and sometimes, after hours of dust, a shape begins to emerge. A line of cut limestone, a corner, a step carved long ago. But even this is not certainty. It could be a wall, a foundation, a false start. It takes patience, days of measuring, of photographing, of brushing until the original surface appears, if it still exists at all. At sites like Cleopatra Magna, this has been the rhythm for nearly 2 decades. Every few meters might contain something. A coin, a fragment of pottery, a buried shaft. Each find must be treated with respect. Removed, recorded, preserved. Even the soil itself is bagged and studied. Beneath this temple, multiple burial shafts have been discovered, each one descending into darkness, like a whisper into the earth. Some end in nothing, others in small chambers. 2 golden tongues found in a tomb. A mummified woman with a finely carved mask. Another wrapped in linen, still bearing traces of ancient pigment. Are they Cleopatra? No, but they speak. They tell us this place was used for elite burials, that it was sacred, that it was active during her lifetime, and that keeps the search alive. Then there is underwater archaeology. Picture it now. Divers descending through cloudy harbor waters. They carry no heavy machinery, only lights, measuring tape, and hope. Visibility is low, 5 feet, sometimes less. The seabed is cluttered. Silt shifts with every motion. And yet, below the surface are clues. A sphinx, its features weathered. A column base. Stone blocks carved with faint Greek. Each artifact must be mapped, floated carefully to the surface, catalogued. There are no sweeping discoveries, only small truths. And sometimes, the suggestion of something more. In recent dives near the submerged island of Antarhodos, marine archaeologists found structures that could have been part of the palace. Staircases leading nowhere, broken door frames, wall segments still upright. It is slow going. Each season, a few meters more explored, and the sea always tries to take it back. Above, the city pulses, but below, a fragment of Cleopatra's world waits. And still, the archaeologists return, not for fame, not for riches, but for the past. Because in every chipped amphora, in every carving weathered to near invisibility, there is meaning. Even absence can tell a story. Imagine now a notebook, lying beside the dig site, its pages filled with sketches, numbers, a note, red granite fragment, north trench, possibly foundation stone. No excitement, just possibility. This is how we learn. Not with thunder, but with dust. And it is here, in the silence of excavation, that Cleopatra's tomb might someday emerge. Not with a triumphant cry, but with a breath, a step, a niche, a chamber that opens into dim light. For now, that chamber remains closed, but the path to it is being drawn, line by line. Now, let yourself imagine a place where the sand gathers not in wild dunes, but in quiet ripples along low stone walls. A place where palm trees sway gently beneath a sun that has seen the passage of empires. Where the breeze carries only the rustle of reeds and the distant sighs of the Mediterranean. And where every stone underfoot may hold, silently, the breath of a forgotten queen. This is Cleopatra Magna, a temple complex west of Alexandria, where excavation is not an act of disruption, but of reverence, not of sudden revelation, but of careful, calibrated inquiry. A slow listening to what lies buried not just beneath the surface, but beneath centuries of silence, myth, and speculation. Here, amid scattered blocks of limestone and the broken colonnades of what was once a thriving ritual center, archaeologists move with the grace of those who know that even the smallest misstep might obscure what they most wish to reveal. For Cleopatra Magna has become, in recent years, one of the most tantalizing sites in the ongoing search for Cleopatra's final resting place. Its name means the Great Tomb of Osiris, and it stands as a quiet guardian over the land that once blurred the lines between gods and monarchs, myth and rule, life and the world beyond. The temple itself, dating to the 3rd century BCE, is thought to have been commissioned during the reign of Ptolemy II, placing it well within the lifetime of Cleopatra's ancestors, and perhaps even under her own patronage in later decades, if only by proximity and continued reverence. Its dedication to Osiris, the god of the afterlife, of resurrection and rebirth, lends the site an unmistakable spiritual weight. For Cleopatra, as a self-declared living embodiment of Isis, consort to Osiris, may have seen this temple not just as sacred, but as a fitting final resting place for herself and for Antony, her Roman counterpart, her partner in loss, her partner in legacy. The lead archaeologist on this long-standing excavation, Dr. Kathleen Martinez, has followed a hypothesis grounded in both textual interpretation and symbolic logic, that if Cleopatra believed herself to be the earthly incarnation of Isis, and if she sought, in death, not only dignity but divinity, then she might have chosen, or perhaps even built, a burial chamber near or beneath this very temple to emulate the eternal bond of Isis and Osiris. It is a theory that inspires deep fascination, not least because of the commitment with which it has been pursued, nearly 2 decades of continued excavation, year by year, trench by trench, shaft by shaft. And what has been found here is compelling. Coins bearing Cleopatra's profile have surfaced in the soil-weathered silver discs etched with their unmistakable features, once used in the marketplaces of Alexandria, now unearthed in this temple complex far from the city, as though dropped by time itself, waiting quietly to be remembered. Fragments of statues, carved in the Ptolemaic style, have emerged from the earth, their surfaces worn smooth by age, but their forms still discernible, perhaps even bearing the likenesses of high officials from her reign, or of Cleopatra herself, though no clear inscriptions confirm it. Most strikingly, a deep series of vertical shafts burial pits carved into the limestone bedrock have been uncovered beneath the temple's rear sanctuary. These shafts descend into darkness, narrow and steep, each one leading to small burial chambers, many of them sealed or filled with rubble, a few holding mummies so well preserved that faint traces of linen wrappings and golden ornament still remain among them. A pair of golden tongues placed in the mouths of the deceased, a practice intended to enable speech in the afterlife, perhaps whispered prayers to Osiris in a world beyond breath. Yet, the queen has not been found. Not here. Not yet. And so we ask, are these discoveries signs of something greater still buried? Or are they remnants of elite burial practices unrelated to Cleopatra's final chapter? Skepticism gently voiced, softly measured, comes from many corners of the academic world. Some Egyptologists point out that Cleopatra, as queen, and particularly as a Ptolemaic monarch, accustomed to ruling from the heart of Alexandria's royal quarter, would more likely have chosen to be buried close to her palace, among her ancestors, within the city she ruled and loved, not in a temple many miles west, in a site more commonly associated with provincial rituals and priestly ceremonies. Others note the absence, so far, of any inscriptions, cartouches, or definitive royal architecture, no doorway bearing her name, no funerary stele, no carved evidence that this was intended as a royal tomb, rather than simply a temple that accommodated high-status burials during a turbulent and transitioning time in Egypt's long history. But still, the work continues, because absence is not the same as negation, because sometimes history hides its most important truths in the folds of places that do not loudly announce their significance, because the shaft yet unexamined, the chamber yet unopened, the block not yet turned, might still offer what centuries of searching have not. And there is, too, the possibility that Cleopatra, ever conscious of legacy, ever aware of her enemies, ever measured in her decisions, might have deliberately chosen a resting place far from the city that was already slipping into Roman hands, a place where her tomb would not be paraded in triumph, A place where her death, like her life, could be shaped on her own terms. The desert has no memory for pageantry, but it has patience, and it holds its secrets deep. So as Dr. Martinez and her team return each season through summer heat and dust storms, through slow grant cycles and steady academic review, they walk that narrow line between faith and fact, between what the earth offers freely and what it only hints at with shadows. You may imagine them now, arriving before dawn, setting out tools on a canvas tarp, kneeling beside the newest shaft as the sun climbs slowly over the limestone hills and the sound of wind moves gently through broken columns. They work not for glory, but for memory, and in that they honor her. Cleopatra, the queen who disappeared, may yet lie beneath them, or perhaps she does not. But the act of looking quietly, reverently, patiently, is in itself a kind of remembrance. Let your mind wander now, not far from the heat and hush of Taposiris Magna, but back toward the sea, toward the lapping waves that once kissed Alexandria's harbors, toward other places less famous, perhaps, and yet not without possibility. Because while much of the public eye is turned toward one site, the story of Cleopatra's tomb may lie, quietly, elsewhere. There are other candidates, other corners of Alexandria and its surrounding sacred topography that whisper just softly enough to keep archaeologists leaning closer, ears tilted toward the sand. The first of these places is the Eastern Necropolis. It rests not far from the ancient city's eastern edge, a burial ground long used during the Greco-Roman period. Here, the dead were interred in rock-cut tombs, arranged in modest but orderly configurations, some with frescoes and inscriptions, others with niches carved into the limestone to hold urns and bodies. This site, largely buried beneath modern development, has revealed layers of urban death, of merchants and priests, scribes and scholars, people who lived in the shadow of the library, the museum, and the palace complex. It is not grand, and that, perhaps, is why it tempts some researchers. What if Cleopatra had chosen not magnificence, but concealment? What if she understood, with eerie foresight, that monuments attract conquerors, but quiet corners preserve? To be buried among the people, not with fanfare, but in stillness, would be a decision not of humility, perhaps, but of protection, of vanishing by choice. Yet so far, excavations in the Eastern Necropolis have uncovered nothing conclusively royal. No sarcophagus with a Ptolemaic name, no royal cartouches or regalia. Still, it is not dismissed. There are areas inaccessible. There are ruins built upon ruins. There are streets under which even archaeologists cannot yet dig. It may hold something yet. Now drift a little farther, back toward the coast. Let the breeze come stronger, filled with the scent of salt and thyme. And picture, just offshore, an island, now gone. The island of Pharos. Once, this island was connected to the mainland by a great causeway known as the Heptastadion. And at its end stood one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the lighthouse of Alexandria. Nearly 400 feet tall, it rose in tiers of white stone, its mirrored flame visible across the Mediterranean. Its beacon was a symbol of Ptolemaic engineering, a literal and metaphorical light in the world. And near it, some believe, Cleopatra might have built a tomb, not for secrecy, but for symbolism. To rest beneath the Pharos would be to sleep forever beneath the eternal flame, to be seen by sailors and merchants from every corner of the known world, to remain, in death, what she was in life, visible, luminous, monumental. Ancient sources place palatial structures on the island, temples, watchtowers, courtyards where the queen may have walked. And while the island itself was mostly destroyed by a sequence of earthquakes, some underwater remnants still remain: columns, carved stones, fragments of statues lying in the sanded silence beneath Alexandria's eastern harbor. If a tomb had once been built there, It may have collapsed. It may have slipped into the sea. It may still lie beneath the surf, in pieces unreadable. Divers have explored the area. Some believe the layout suggests ceremonial buildings. Others that nothing clearly tomb-like has yet been found. But again, that word, yet, the island of Pharos, now submerged and partially rebuilt as part of Alexandria's modern coastline, may conceal its secrets too deeply for modern tools. Or it may simply be waiting. There is a poetic symmetry in imagining Cleopatra buried beneath a lighthouse. A woman known for brilliance, for reflection, for drawing others near, watching over a harbor where her ships once gathered. Yet it is, like the rest, still only a possibility. There are other scattered theories. Some suggest a tomb hidden beneath one of the still-standing mosques of the medieval city, their foundations built unknowingly upon Ptolemaic ruins. Others imagine a tomb removed, destroyed in later conquests, its materials repurposed to build something else, a wall, a fountain, a column. But these are wisps. What lingers are three places: the sands of Taposiris Magna, the waters around Pharos, and the buried streets of Alexandria's necropolis. Each one holds a kind of silence. Each one holds a thread. The problem is not that we know nothing. It is that we know, just enough to wonder. And so, the tomb becomes more than a destination. It becomes a presence, an idea, a chamber imagined, a light beneath the waves, a whisper under stone. And now, let us return to the surface. The sea settles behind us. The desert breathes its heat into the hills. And we find ourselves not in the age of Cleopatra, nor in the aftermath of Rome, but in the present. A time of satellites and sonar, of archaeology by drone, of ground-penetrating radar and sonar maps drawn in swells of blue and gold. And yet, even here, with all our tools, all our databases and digital renderings, we are still, in many ways, walking blind. Because the search for Cleopatra's tomb, this most enduring mystery, remains as much a matter of patience as it is of science, as much a question of access as it is of evidence. To search in modern Alexandria is not like wandering through a forgotten ruin, where every stone is exposed to the sky and every footprint welcomes excavation. It is to navigate a living city, a dense, sprawling place of apartment buildings, asphalt streets, and a million daily lives where beneath every cafe, beneath every concrete foundation, beneath every taxi route and schoolyard, may lie fragments of the ancient world. But where digging is a luxury that cannot always be afforded. Permits are difficult. Resources are limited. The city cannot simply pause for the sake of memory. So even when scholars are certain, when the geometry of ancient texts aligns with the curve of a modern avenue, they can do little more than mark the place. And wait. Elsewhere, in the coastal waters, the difficulties shift form, but not weight. Marine archaeologists dive beneath the harbor's surface, searching among silt-choked ruins that may, or may not, contain remnants of the royal quarter. But underwater archaeology is a field defined by effort far beyond its results. Each object found beneath the waves takes weeks, sometimes months, to recover and conserve. Stone is heavy. Salt is corrosive. Currents shift everything over time. And much of what lies there is broken. Statues toppled, inscriptions fragmented, entire doorways collapsed under their own weight. In this kind of search, even absence is ambiguous. Is the tomb not there? Or is it simply still hidden beneath the next layer? Another meter of clay. Another 1,000 years of drift. And then there are the temples. Taposiris Magna, Abusir, others along the desert's edge. Here, the problem is not overdevelopment, but uncertainty. Each discovery must be weighed carefully. Coins with Cleopatra's name suggest presence, but not burial. Mummies and gilded masks reflect ritual, but not royalty. And so, Even as archaeologists descend deeper into shafts carved before Augustus ever reached Egypt, they do so knowing that they may never find what they seek. Not because it isn't there, but because the evidence may have eroded, been looted, been lost in fire, or simply never marked to begin with. The modern search, then, is shaped by contradictions. We know more than ever about ancient customs, about burial patterns, about Ptolemaic architecture. And yet, the more we learn, the more possibilities open, and with them, uncertainty expands. Funding is another quiet obstacle. Excavation is slow, expensive work, and as interest waxes and wanes, projects must adapt to changing tides of political and institutional support. Still, the dream remains. For some, the dream is academic. To find the tomb would be to settle one of antiquity's most enduring debates, to anchor a narrative that floats without a fixed point. For others, it is symbolic. To reclaim a woman's story from the myths that have overwritten it, to see her buried, not in romance, but in history. And for a few, the dream is personal. Imagine the archaeologist at the trench's edge, her knees in the dust, tracing the faintest groove in a limestone block. She is not here for television crews, not here for headlines, but because for her, Cleopatra is not a myth, but a voice that deserves a final word. And yet there is another truth, one quieter, one almost sacred, that even if the tomb is never found, even if the chamber remains sealed, the inscriptions unread, the sarcophagus untouched, there is a kind of grace in the mystery, because Cleopatra, more than many, understood the power of ambiguity. She ruled with symbolism. She shaped her image. She used mystery as a tool, and perhaps in death, she ensured that the final chapter of her story would never be closed, but left slightly ajar. Enough for us to wonder, to search, to imagine, and perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all. And so, here we are, near the end of a long journey through dust, through myth, through temple and sea and silence. And we ask gently, curiously, and perhaps with a sigh we hadn't quite noticed before, why does it matter so much? Why has this one missing tomb, this one queen lost to time, captured so many minds for so long? What is it, exactly, about Cleopatra's tomb that has become more than a search for a chamber of stone, but a search for something quieter, something softer, something that lives beneath the surface of historical curiosity and enters instead the space of longing? Perhaps it begins with the simple idea that every story deserves an ending. And when we look at Cleopatra's life, with all its brilliance and complexity and contradiction, we are struck by how complete it seems, how cinematic, how sweeping, and yet how unfinished it remains, how unresolved, as though someone walked away from the final chapter while the ink was still wet. And perhaps, too, there is something deep in us and ancient, almost instinctive desire to know where the dead rest, to feel that the lives which shaped the world, whether through beauty or brilliance or ambition or sorrow, were not simply erased when their hearts ceased beating, but honored in a place, a room, a marker that says, she was here. Because in a world so often uncertain, the idea that even someone as extraordinary as Cleopatra might simply vanish, that her body might crumble unceremoniously beneath rubble, that her story might hang, unanchored like a flag in wind, touches something fragile in us. We want her to be real, not just in ink and film and coins, but in stone. We want to know that she returned to the earth, not as myth, but as woman. And perhaps this desire is not really about Cleopatra at all. Perhaps the question of where she rests is, in truth, our way of asking what remains of any of us, of legacy, of memory, of meaning. Because Cleopatra's life, so filled with power and peril, strategy and spectacle, intimacy and illusion, reminds us that history is not made only by soldiers and cities in battles, but by choices, by language, by the quiet way someone reads a scroll by lamplight or chooses which god to invoke before a political negotiation. And if she, with all her might, all her fame, all her manipulation of image and myth, could disappear into the folds of time without a trace, then what, we wonder, can we hope to leave behind? That, perhaps, is why we search, not only for Cleopatra, but for something of ourselves. We search because we want to believe that mystery still exists, that even in a world of satellites and algorithms and databases that stretch across the planet, there is still something sacred in not knowing and in trying to know. We search because we are soothed by the idea of returning, of finding what was lost, and because to search for her tomb is, in some gentle way, to sit by her side again, to say, "You have not been forgotten," even if we never find it, even if the tomb lies broken, sunken, turned to sand. The act of searching becomes its own kind of vigil. So you may picture, now, not a great discovery, but a quiet room, a researcher with a notebook, a diver tying on his mask, a brush clearing dust from a groove that may be nothing or everything. They do not rush. They do not shout. They move with the reverence of those who understand that absence can speak louder than presence. And maybe, just maybe, the tomb continues to captivate us, because in the end, we are comforted by the thought that some parts of the past do not yield easily, that some doors remain unopened, some questions remain beautifully unanswered, and some queens, no matter how many centuries pass, continue to walk, just slightly out of reach, through the corridors of our imagination. Now, let yourself settle more deeply into stillness, into a quieter rhythm. Let the air around you soften. The sounds fade gently into the background as we turn our attention not to what has been found, but to what has not. Because there is something curiously powerful, almost sacred, in the moments when history does not speak. We often think of the past as a story written down in stone, a tale waiting only to be unearthed and translated, as though every ruin holds a message, every sarcophagus a speech, every scroll a complete thought. And yet, the truth is quieter. Much of the past is not preserved in declarations or monuments. It is preserved in fragments, in silences, in questions. A broken inscription, a wall where a name has been scraped away, a chamber that should be there, but isn't. And Cleopatra's missing tomb is just such a silence. It is a quiet space that lives not only in sand and stone, but in the minds of all who have tried to imagine it, in the way it shapes how we talk about her, how we remember her, and how we draw the line between the known and the unknown. There is, in this silence, a reminder that history is not an answer machine. It is not a perfect archive or a complete book. It is a landscape full of fog and ridges, where you may climb for hours and discover only a slightly clearer view of something still distant. And this, while frustrating to some, is also what makes history feel real. Because in the quiet, we are invited not just to receive, but to reflect. When the past does not answer, it gives us space to listen more carefully, to feel the weight of time, not in facts, but in absence. It allows us to feel how ancient lives were not shaped for our convenience, that they unfolded without regard for future documentation, that their thoughts were not written with us in mind, and that even queens as monumental as Cleopatra might slip quietly into obscurity, not by design, but by the slow erosion of memory. The silence around her tomb, the lack of detail, the missing inscriptions and records, is a silence full of meaning. It reminds us that power does not guarantee permanence. That legacy, no matter how fiercely constructed, can dissolve if no one tends it. And that even the most famous names in history are, in the end, people as vulnerable to forgetting as any of us. But there is comfort, too, because this silence is not truly empty. It echoes. It lingers. And in it, we can hear the outlines of who she was, not from a tomb or an epitaph, but from everything else we've tried to piece together. From her coins, from her political moves, From the way Rome wrote about her curious, suspicious, impressed, afraid. From the questions we continue to ask. You might imagine this silence like a room lit only by candlelight. You cannot see everything clearly. The edges blur. But in that dim glow, there is intimacy. A sense that you are not intruding upon certainty, but dwelling within mystery. And in that mystery, there is space to feel, to imagine her, not as an icon or a character, but as someone who lived within the boundaries of her world, made choices, navigated danger, and one day closed her eyes for the last time, knowing, perhaps, that her story would be carried by others. And maybe she knew, or hoped, or feared that her resting place would be found, but perhaps not. Perhaps she chose a quiet tomb, a hidden door, a chamber built not for visitors or spectacle, but for peace. In the end, the silence is hers, and our role is not to fill it, but to sit with it, to listen, to remember, to let the questions remain open, because history is not only about solving, it is about staying curious. And so, as we find ourselves nearing the end of this long, quiet passage through time, through tombs and texts and tides and thought, we come to something more abstract, more delicate, yet no less real. The strange comfort that lives within a mystery that has not been solved. Because while we so often seek answers, crave resolution, long to draw a final line beneath the question, there is something uniquely soothing about a story that is allowed to remain incomplete. Not broken, but open, softly unresolved, like a sentence spoken just before sleep, trailing off not into silence, but into stillness. And Cleopatra's tomb, or rather the absence of it, the not knowing of it, has become more than a gap in the archaeological record. It has become a space into which wonder flows. It has become a pause, a hush in the noise of history. Because in a world increasingly drawn to answers, in which every image is searchable, every record digitized, every timeline color-coded and compressed into scrolling moments, there remains something deeply human, almost ancient in itself, about the act of not knowing something and letting it be. There is a kind of reverence in mystery, a recognition that some parts of the past are not ours to control or uncover or name, that some doors are meant to stay closed, or at least to open slowly, quietly, at their own pace. And perhaps, if Cleopatra's tomb were found tomorrow, if the seal were broken, if the sarcophagus opened to reveal her bones, her face, her diadem resting gently on her brow, it would not only be extraordinary, it would also mark the end of something, the end of this long, shared wondering, the end of the myth not as fiction, but as possibility. Because as long as the tomb remains hidden, she remains just slightly out of reach, not frozen in glass, not catalogued in a museum, but moving through our minds like mist over water, like a light just behind the curtain. She becomes not just a figure in history, but a presence, something that lives softly between fact and imagination, between research and reflection, between night and dawn. And in this in-between, there is comfort. Because when the answers are not given, we are free to sit with the questions, to let them rock us gently, to feel not the pressure to explain, but the invitation to imagine. Perhaps you're listening now in the dark, your head resting on the pillow, your thoughts slowing, each breath quieter than the last. And maybe, as you drift between waking and sleeping, you can feel the gentle weight of history pressing not as burden, but as blanket. You can picture Cleopatra not on a throne, not in a film, but in her tomb, wherever it may be, beneath the desert, beneath the sea, or perhaps even beneath the city, quiet and complete, not lost, but resting, and you no longer seeking her, but simply being with her in this quiet moment as centuries pass like clouds across the moon. Now we arrive, not at a discovery, but at a resting place, not for Cleopatra, not for her tomb, but for the mind that has wandered with her, for you, You who have followed her footsteps from the golden corridors of Alexandria to the underwater ruins of Antirhodos, from the dusty shafts of Taposiris Magna to the ink-stained scrolls of ancient historians, from the echo of her voice in Shakespeare's lines, to the quiet space where we still ask where and why and what remains. This was never just a story of stone. It was a story of seeking, of the hush that falls when the past refuses to explain itself, of the comfort we find in that refusal, of the simple truth that not everything needs to be named or known to be held with care. Because Cleopatra, as we have seen, was never only what history recorded, never just a queen or a lover, never just a strategist or a seductress. She was a person, stitched into her world by language, by ritual, by power, and by time. And when she passed from that world, she left behind not a monument, but a question, a space, an opening. And we, centuries later, lean into that space, not because we expect to fill it, but because it reminds us that some things are worth wondering about, even if they never quite reveal themselves. Her tomb, whether beneath stone or wave or dream, may never be found. It may not need to be, because the rhythm of her life, its rise and fall, its eloquence and defiance, its grace and strategy, has already taken shape in the memory of the world. She is not buried. She is remembered. And even in silence, she speaks. Perhaps in the end, the greatest gift she left us was not gold or knowledge or legacy, but this, a gentle awareness that the past is not behind us, but beside us, always humming just below the surface of the present, softly reminding us that we are never alone in time. And so, let this final thought carry you gently into the night. You have wandered through ancient halls, stood beneath temple arches, glided over harbor waters, read the names of gods by candlelight, and now you may rest. Let the search go quiet. Let the tomb remain undisturbed. Let your breath slow to the rhythm of Nile tides. Let your mind soften like silt. And know that, for tonight, you too are part of the long, unbroken story of curiosity, of reverence, and of peace. Sleep now, with the past beside you, the mystery intact, and the queen still waiting, just beyond the edge of knowing. Good night.